It's Feed the Trolls. We are here, and I'm going to do a disclaimer just right off the bat. It is the 29th of April. Lurppis and Thorin were very kind enough to come on to do the show today because I wanted to take a little holiday. I'm going to a place called Cape Town here in South Africa, and this is only going to go up next week, Monday. It's Tuesday now. Let us pray that Astralis doesn't sell the whole damn organization before I
By the way, we do have like a really bad track record, Tommy, of like stuff like that. We do like the roster move episode, and then like they do make the roster move like right after we already recorded it, but didn't release it yet. We've done that a few times. Don't worry, it's all good. I think we might be safe. I was saying to her before we started, though, surely we're safe on this. Like, they're not really going to like pack up shop within a week. Like, it's going to slowly take time to sell off assets and something like that, anyways. Surely.
I will be so mad if it suddenly gets announced tomorrow, or it'll get announced as I get to the beach and have my cocktail. I'll see it on HLTV, but whatever. We'll have.
What I love is, by the way, even though it's definitely not at all the way it is, like spoiler, even though fans are going to do this, if you're all fans for CS, that I'm assuming you are, if you're watching this episode, when we talk about like business concepts of Astralis, that doesn't directly relate to CS stuff, and it definitely, by the way, doesn't relate directly to all your results in the game. But I will pretend, for the sake of humour, that it does, and act like. Does this actually mean for real, Sam, that the last possible move they thought of in Astralis before just shuttering the whole org was like, I don't know, fuck, it's recruit cadiaN or something, like, just give it one last roll of the dice. And then when that doesn't work, they were like, right, well, time for me in this shotgun to make an acquaintance. Why is that the way the org runs? Like, right, step 1, recruit cadiaN. Step 2, try and qualify for the major. Step 3, question mark. Step 4, just close the whole org. Like, all right, it's okay. It's one way to do it, I guess.
I think what's very important is for us to remember the idea that cadiaN was going to Astralis to destroy them from the inside.
He did. Listen, he nailed it. I know.
And he did it. Okay,
I actually feel like that's an underrated storyline, isn't it? Like, remember the guy who was the GM during that period was the former heroic GM. 2 of the star players of them joined, and then they just got cadiaN at the end. And then they did like some mad suicide mission, just destroy Astralis on the way out. Like, in a way, that is actually gangster. Because I have to say, that's the only time ever, Sam, that anyone actually beat Nicola Nyholm. It turns out you just had to do it from internally. You had to just go inside his org and do it. It's the only time I've ever seen him take the L.
The call is coming from inside the house.
Exactly, fair play. You got him on that one.
He played the long game, but cadiaN did it in the end. Okay, before we get into the business side of Astralis, let's just talk very quickly about the big move that has happened that everyone is very excited about. And also we have to talk about it because for a long time, this man was pretty much every topic of these shows when we started out. HooXi to Astralis. Lurppis, I mean, we'll start with you. What do you think about this move? Should it have happened before cadiaN?
Somebody said this on Twitter in the last week, but it always just seemed like a better fit. Like the cadiaN device fit was just like never gonna work, and I think that was like a team where you could have had like a less skilled in-game leader, and like maybe just like made it work with the good pieces who know how to play together, etc. So to me, it makes sense on paper. I still have reservations on like HooXi is just like not very good, and it's like increasingly hard to play if one of your players is just way worse individually than everybody else. But I think it's a better fit than cadiaN. And I should preface this by saying that like you honestly get like 3 hours of Counter-Strike a week that is watchable from the West Coast. So like I am increasingly, out of the loop on like everything that happens, because like even the Melbourne event is like it's scheduled for Europe. Like Australia hours would actually work for the US.
That'd be like midnight start time for you or something, man, right?
Yeah, it starts at midnight because like they want to play it so that Europe can watch instead of they actually just played it at Australian times, which is what they did for groups. Most of it was watchable.
Right.
I wondered about that when I was watching it, because obviously the time in South Africa is exactly the same as Europe, and we were watching it like during lunchtime, and I was like, how is this Australia time? But then you've explained it to us. It's just impossible for you to watch Counter-Strike. We'll have a quick focus.
You didn't miss anything not watching Astralis, so don't worry about that.
Don't worry about that.
It's like going, I haven't got around watching last season of Game of Thrones. Don't bother, mate. Don't even bother.
I watched the VODs for parts of the final. I saw the 12C collapse. 12-6 collapse, that 1v2 from Zybu, 1v3 maybe. So I think I got the gist of it.
You got the best part, which is all that matters. Let's just, I want to frame this question to you, Thorin. I think, and I'm just throwing it out there, I have absolutely no proof. I have no factual basis. I have no insights. I have no secret birds who DM me about this. I think Astralis probably did look at HooXi before cadiaN, and for some absurd reason went with cadiaN anyway. Do you think that is the case, and they've now had to very quickly double back on their decision?
This is one of those ones where if you ever look at what people did and crucially didn't say in interviews around the time he joined, first of all, if everyone can remember, on HLTV Confirmed, Striker, I think, was the one who had the info or whatever. And he kept doing that thing where it's like, I've got a secret, but I can't tell. But then obviously the only value of a secret is in telling if you're someone who values that sort of like salaciousness. So what he did was he kept hinting. And by the end, it's like, you may as well have just said the fucking secret. Because what he did basically was on the show, they were all doing that thing like, but why would they recruit cadiaN? What does this mean? Like Stown wanted him in specific, all that like jazz, right? And basically what Striker suggested was that like they actually had two other people they were trying to get before cadiaN. I think he even implied one was a non-IGL. It was implied to me it was maybe Zyphon, who used to be in Astralis talent, because obviously he was like a good player at the time. He was in like Static or whatever the fuck I think it was. So anyway, it was implied to me, if you looked at it, that actually it wasn't what people in the like fans thought, which is that like Stown and Yabby are at the end of their rope and they were like, oh, cadiaN, can you join again with it? It was actually implied that maybe the org selected him and that, like I say, he wasn't even the first choice. And it was just, if you remember, crucially, it spawned that drama where he then played at that blast because they lied and said the bro guy was ill, right? Which also, it makes it seem unlikely cadiaN was even close to the first option because basically they'd actually missed the fucking roster cutoff, which is why they had to pull that shenanigans and have a player essentially, even though he didn't, thanks to his agent, pretend he was ill so he couldn't play the game. So with all that said, I actually got the sense, because if you later saw, I believe someone did ask Rogger, the coach of this team who joined around this time, something like, why didn't you take HooXi? And he made some sort of comment like that, like he didn't want HooXi or something weird. So to me, anyway, to surmise, I take from all of this that HooXi's name was in the mix during all of this, but that for whatever reason, people chose not to pick him. And somehow, I get the vibe it was the org. They just selected cadiaN at the end and then they did this move. I don't even think that one was necessarily one where the players picked whoever they wanted. I think they were just in a bad spot in terms of results. So they had to kind of just take whatever they were offered, because presumably at this point in time, think about the timing on this as well. At the time that like they bring in cadiaN as IGL and the device stops being IGL, I think it was only something like 2 months till he had to just not play the major and he had all that illness. So it's one of those examples, a bit like last year's G2, where I think the whole roster was a stopgap and no one really thought this was like the 5 players that are going to win the major, or this is like our dream lineup. So it is inferred to me that they probably thought about HooXi. But that in itself, by the way, is what makes that move interesting to me. Because while on the one hand they accepted cadiaN, I actually got the vibe from how it was presented there. Maybe these players actually think they're above HooXi. Maybe they have like an elitism. Like, put it this way, I won't say who, but if I was a device or a Stown, I might go like, who the fuck's HooXi? Like, why do I need you, mate? Like, I was doing well on my own. So I don't know on that one. It's one where from the outside, I agree. Like a lot of experts, I would have tried this move. It's better than cadiaN one, but that's about 50 times better. But I also agree with Tommy. I don't think it immediately will make them a top team. I don't think this will fix everything.
One thing that I did think about is I don't know what cadiaN's contract situation with Liquid was. So like I don't know if he actually just got out cheap from Heroic because he was benched, and like maybe it was sort of a simple deal from Liquid that it was easy to get out of. But I think HooXi did put out like one of the things that everybody does now, which is like, oh, I'm becoming a free agent. Please pick me up around New Year's.
Right.
So it's also possible that like G2 just thought that they could demand a king's ransom for HooXi, and Astralis said no, and like it was just cheaper to go with Kate. Like that also is a potential consideration.
That's one that no one ever, this is actually something that no one ever talks about, is the finances behind players, and what actually makes sense when you're buying and selling and buying people out of contracts is that sometimes it just makes more financial sense to go in another direction because it's going to save you a bit of money. But we never talk about that, and we never...
No.
We try and guess what the amounts are, but it's a conversation that doesn't happen. Do you think, though, that in football they do it, right? They talk about how much the contracts are. We know how much the salaries are. Do you think we should have a more open space in esports where that information is actually publicly available?
By the way, if you had it, I think literally, even though people will bring up the negatives of like the obvious example would be, I mean, everyone would think now of last year's Falcons where everyone knows they were making mega box salaries, but they were shit in the game. Look, everyone who got the bad contract, by the way, and played badly would get flamed, but that's just sports. You'd also have, I think the actual positives would be so overwhelmingly positive, actually, for how we'd correctly put in context other people's contracts. Like, I'll give you the obvious example, Sam. I'll tell you people who tomorrow, their reputations would double and triple in magnitude. dude, is the people who are min-maxing like a motherfucker, like Ash from Gamer Legion. It's already people think he's good. Bro, if you knew the kind of salaries he's having to offer these players and why they all leave to every other squad, you'd think he was a genius. By the way, same thing with like those Eternal Fire players. If you knew what kind of salary they were on, they were fucking crazy overperforming their value relative to the world. Meanwhile, like, I would imagine the guess I would have would be people like the OGs of the world. You'd probably be incredibly underwhelmed if you know how much they paid salary and how little results they ever get. Like, so I actually feel like the reason it would be fair, because I always try to do it on these shows, is if I know myself someone was really cheap or a free transfer, I'm not going to judge them the same way as if it was like you broke the bank and paid the megabucks for that guy. I do think that if you know that information, you should factor it in. It's only fair to do it, in my opinion. Like, all trades aren't uniform and equal.
Well, that's the Smith's argument from back in the day when people were criticizing him before people recognized that, hey, maybe the role player shouldn't get paid the same as the world's best star player, who actually carries the team to everything they accomplish and is the person that sponsorships are sold against. So I could see from both sides. Like, there's a reason why teams don't want salaries to come out. I think from the player's perspective, it feels like there's very little downside, because like if you're put yourself in the player's shoes, like either people realize like, hey, you're actually overpaid, like, okay, like you're still getting paid, like, you know, you might be overpaid, but like you're still getting paid, so like how bad is it? But it might help correct things where, you know, surprisingly Duncan's on salary that's 50% below market, but like nobody knows that he'd be
There's a lot of
willing
players
to do
lying
a
to
much,
each other, right? Yeah,
he'd be
quite a famous
willing
thing.
to do a deal that actually is here. Everybody assumes it would have to be
Yes.
this, and there's a lot of information.
Yes.
Like, a lot of this gets, you know, I haven't been to events in a while, but at least the way this used to get around is like you talk to people at after parties after a couple of drinks, and like that's how most of the information gets around in like casual conversations. And I suspect that there is some bias, and it tends to be upwards, not downwards, in those conversations. So a lot of even the negotiations with players, I think, just get skewed by, I was told that this person makes this much and I'm better than this person, so I need to make more than this. Like that is the kind of thing that might have actually led to that one MIBR team disintegrating, where they just like demanded like a number and we said no, and they thought that we were bluffing.
Put it this way, the most famous one, as you're implying there, Tommy, is the most famous one ever, is either a friend of a pro, just for bravado reason, exaggerates his salary. He was never on it himself, and then the player goes and tries to get that. Or like he says there, the worst one ever is where a team hear a different team that they think is worse in the game than them makes X salary, and that's more than they do. So then they go, well, our number has to be X plus whatever. And it's like, that's not even how this whole thing works. Like, what region are you from? Like, the problem with that is it's so infuriating, even a premise, but it's a real thing. Players do that for sure. For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it is hard to understand for somebody who like has only ever played games like maybe started at 17. Like, I don't know that I would have had like great appreciation for it, but like, you know, when you model these in your head, a lot of the time it is after sports leagues, and like, you know, it doesn't matter where you're from if you play in the Premier League, because like you're getting sold against the Premier League, like that, or that's the product. Like, you're the filler, and like you might make it more popular, but if you're not there, somebody else is there, and people are watching regardless. And it's sort of the same with all the major leagues. The difference here is that the revenue is not centralized, and so as a result, you actually kind of get paid on the team level based on, not to say that the market is perfect, but like you kind of get paid based on like what the actual value of those players are and those assets are, as opposed to like what the aggregate is worth. So like you don't as much, there is like some component of like if you qualify for every single ESL tournament, like you used to be a partner team, or now you're just like among the best teams and you get to go to all of them, like there's like some base level of value that you're kind of guaranteed. But the incremental from like, hey, your jersey is going to be visible in like all these broadcasts, and like people think your team is good, but you're from a country that, you know, just has lower purchasing power, doesn't have a lot of sponsorships locally, like not a lot of brand spending there. People are not interested in like acquiring those users for whatever they're doing, versus, hey, like here are the best players from America. Like that is just a mountain of difference.
We're in the perfect place to start talking about the Astralis business case, which is what this episode is actually about. We spoke about HooXi a little bit. We're not going to do more than that because we actually have to see the guy play in this team. So PGL Astana is when we'll see it, and then we'll have some comments, because what is the point of just sitting here talking for an hour about what we think will happen? What we want to talk about, or at least what I wanted to talk about, was whatever the hell is happening at Astralis. And I want to preface this whole thing by saying, I have very little understanding of how businesses are purchased and
Right.
sold. I always presumed, and I say presume because a little knowledge is dangerous, maybe from what I've read, that an evaluation works is you look at the books and you go, okay, this is how much profit or not profit this is making, this is how many assets they have, and then you do a projection of 10 years to figure out how much profit you could make. And I presume from there is some sort of mathematical equation that will figure out how much a share costs. I don't know if that's how it works. I've never bought a business, but I want to kind of understand the evaluation side of it because we're seeing lots of stuff being discussed about Astralis. So that's why lurppis is here.
Yes.
Before we get into any of that, though, here's a question I'd love answered. And I think this is something that a lot of fans presume they know. They think that prize money and sponsorship, stickers if you're at the major, and merch makes millions and millions, which pays these players' salaries. Doesn't make sense to most of us, though, if you start thinking about the numbers. So, lurppis, can you explain to me how exactly does an esports organization make money? Or actually, maybe, do they even make money? Should be the question.
I think most of them don't make money. Partially that is by choice. Like the belief is, I'll take a step back. So for one, like your kind of high level example of like you look at what the company does, how much money you can make, like how that changes over time and like what that is worth to somebody, that kind of is how you value a business. There is a lot of like nuance to that. Besides that, and like it is said that valuation is more art than science. Like two very smart people can look at the exact same thing and come at completely different conclusions. Like that's not actually that weird when it's something that isn't very predictable, which you could say about basically any esports business. Um, on making money, so like prize money, you can kind of just assume that like almost no organization gets to keep any of it. There's like some change now because of the revenue share structure with the partner leagues being
The club
destroyed.
program or whatever they call it. Yeah.
Being like taken away in its
Yeah.
former structure. Now there's sort of these like club payments. So there is like some payment that is kind of tied to performance in a more explicit way than it previously used to be. So there is like some upside to the teams. The prize money side, I haven't talked to every player. I don't know what every team does, but like it's pretty hard to like it's easy for a team to give on the prize money because like that actually aligns the incentives the right way. Like I want Duncan to win more prize money, but I don't really care if I get a cut of that because even if Duncan makes $1 million a year in prize money, I get what 10% of that. That's 100K. Like that doesn't actually move the needle for me. And I would rather not negotiate. I don't want to use my negotiation power on the 100K. I'd rather try to get something from Duncan that I think might be more valuable. And
obviously the logic that goes without saying, the idea is if I somehow won that amount of money, that amount of tournament placings, you could also then turn into sponsorships and things like that. It has a complementary value, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, like the one way to think about it also is like how scalable is some piece of revenue. So like in theory, like if you think about stickers, set aside like how they performed for a second, just like there's a new thing. Go back to the first event with the stickers for teams. And all of a sudden, for the first time ever, the game publisher is now paying money for the teams. And there's a question of like, how do we divvy this up between players and teams? And what happened back then was that the stickers used to be so little in the first event. It was like, 100, 200,000 per team, like just like not very meaningful, that players ended up getting in many cases like a meaningful portion of that. Like I've heard in some cases players get most of it, some cases they get almost none of it, and some kind of do 50-50. Like going back in those days, I think it's gotten more organization friendly since then. But then at the same time, the belief in that revenue stream growing over time actually led to salaries going up. So, if you were to kind of, this data's not publicly available, but like if you kind of know like when people started getting paid more salary, like it's a pretty good correlation of with this. And the reason is mostly it's not because viewership went up, it's that this is actually, if a new fan comes in and watches and buys a sticker and I get $1 when they spend $1, it gets split between all the teams in reality. But like if I get $1, I actually keep 100 cents on the dollar if I'm not paying anything for the player. Like I could talk myself into, why couldn't those stickers grow to 1 million instead of 200K? So that actually is now 1 million to my bottom line. And it's a lot easier for me to believe that stickers might go from 200K to 300K than that Duncan will win another 1 million of prize money so that I can get the same 100K benefit. So like one part of the equation is what are the revenue streams that are actually valuable for you, both like today and also like going forward? Because one thing you don't want to do is get to like a so-so place today, but you've given away the upside. It's actually much better to be in a place where you're burning money today, but you have these couple of things where like, if this works out, actually we're going to be to the good, as opposed to, hey, we're kind of treading water today. We're not burning money, but we're not making money. But Duncan's keeping all the stickers, so I can't make money from that either. So like, what upside do I have? And that's where the more art than science piece comes in, because a lot of the time those are things that, like, you know, we could have pulled a lot of smart people 10 years ago and asked like where the stickers were going to be. And there isn't one person who would have had like the exact right curve of
No.
like how it grew, got to like the 700 a million before COVID, then like spiked to like the 4 million, for 4.5 million for the top bucket for Paris, and then just like collapsed down for the most recent major. So like that part, it's just like future is inherently unknowable. And like that's where it becomes hard. So if you then think about what sort of is valuable. So like stickers, clearly very valuable. Um, Sponsorships, valuable, because typically like you're actually paying for the players, like they're getting their salary no matter what. So like there typically isn't like a revenue share on top. Like if I sell a new sponsorship, I'm not giving Duncan money for that. I just hope that in like our contract there is sufficient like activations left or whatever I need from Duncan to deliver against that sponsorship. But in theory, that's maybe 30% that you pay out against like the dollar coming in. So like you get to keep 70 cents. It's not the 100 cents on the stickers, but it's much better than prize money. So it's like a trade-off between these. The problem with sponsorships, it's harder to scale. Like you can imagine the game publisher just, stroke of pen, they go from 33% revenue share to 50. That's what Valve did a few years ago. Like that's partly what moved the stickers up. They used to keep 2/3 of all the revenue, and they moved to 50-50. Now, like everybody's seen the estimates of how much they make on those like major stickers. Like, I don't know, is there room to move? Like, sure, feels like it. It's like, again, like where do you handicap that they might go to 67-33 in the future? What that does, like, there's just so many variables that it's just like impossible to know. So you kind of just gotta take your best stab and build a case based on what you think is reasonable. And that's where it gets hard, because there's sort of like like you're thinking about a company in a vacuum. So take Astralis. Like before this news comes out, I don't think there's anybody who really thought that there was going to be like an immediate, or like anybody not in the know that there was going to be like an immediate sale or like any issues, etc. People just kind of thought that they're just trucking along, they have been.
They're even signing a player, mate. Like, there's no reason to.
Yeah, for several years. And so if you'd asked somebody 2 weeks ago or a week ago before the news came out, and they would probably say like, well, like they would bring out Excel, to Sam's point, they would project some future numbers, and they'd say like, well, like I could imagine this working out this way. And like, by the way, like it's not just that you make this in 10 years, it's like, what is it going to do from that point on? And the general sense has been that like this is a growing industry. People play more games year over year. So like if there's more people playing, there's potentially more people watching. So there's more continued growth over a prolonged period of time, so long as like the main games don't lose popularity. One of the nuances is you hear a lot of people talking about interest rates. The easiest way to kind of explain it is if I borrow $100 from Duncan and I agree to pay him $5 of interest in a year, that $5 to Duncan in interest is worth a lot more if the government pays him $0 for the same $100 versus if the government pays him $10. Because if Duncan can lend money to either the government or me, he's going to lend money to the government. The government is lower credit risk. He's going to get repaid by the government, but there's a chance where I might not be able to repay the money. If all of a sudden the rate at which the government pays you interest is higher than what an individual like me pays, that means it's harder for somebody like me to finance my company or whatever I'm doing. So if you look at what happened to interest rates, which has been the big talking point for the last like 4 years, when they shot up in 2022, effectively what happened is rates went up. Everybody could get more interest in this simplified example from like the government in like risk-free interest is like the way people like to talk about it. And so all of a sudden, those cash flows that Sam talked about projecting 10 years out, they became worth a lot less because it used to be that you were comparing like the growth to getting 1% from free for the government, and now you're getting 5. And that is like the component of where the future cash flows actually just become far less valuable when rates go up. So now you go back to Astralis. A week ago, you were just projecting the 10 years and you were taking a position of whatever that was worth, and that was it. But that only works in a vacuum because you have to fund the company to get there, and there's like path dependency. So it's one thing to be break even today and make a little bit more money tomorrow and a little bit more money the next day and the next day and the next day to infinity. And like you'll just have to figure out what the value of those payments is over time. In another case, you might make a little bit of money today and then lose lots of money tomorrow. And if you can't fund the operations, like you might just drown at that point. So you never get to come out on the other side. And I don't actually believe like that's the situation which Astralis is in, even though that's the reporting. But like that is like the difference between, hey, like we're kind of doing a fire sale, like we have to get this out, which is how I read the HLTV report. Again, like I don't actually believe that's the case, but that is how I read the reporting, and sort of like a what's called a going concern operation.
Put it this way, I'll ask what I think is an obvious clarifying question. One area where you could potentially tie this to something based on like results in the game is obviously people will know that ever since COVID, Astralis never makes the fucking majors. They've just missed like 5 majors in a row. And obviously they've just missed one right now, lurppis. Well, the premise could be, if I go with what you're saying here, it's not that like Astralis, the org, no longer has investor value and like it wouldn't be worth anything in a valuation. And it's also not that like they can't continue on to tomorrow. But if part of the operating costs, because remember, they have like those players from Europe, they signed for millions of dollars. They re-signed Device, I think, last year, bro. So I imagine he's on a massive contract. You think of all they signed cadiaN and HooXi and all these costs that they're adding in. If part of their business plan was, but we're going to qualify to the major, then in the short term, at least, as in right now, they might have to sell off some stuff to make up whatever they were thinking they were going to get from the major or something along those lines.
Yeah, so that's the issue with the major structure,
Right.
essentially. Is like you cannot sign good players if you don't bank on making it to the major. Because if I'm unwilling to pay these players based on them qualifying, you can bet that there's somebody who's willing to do that. And so
Sure.
that essentially, like most of the time the market ends up being right, but not always. And like in Astralis' case, they've been on the wrong side many times in a row.
I've also
And
heard they have pretty good salaries, some of their players, by the way. Like I've heard they've got some of the top ones, yeah.
But so that is like the near term concern.
Right.
Again, like I don't have any knowledge
No,
here.
no.
Like I don't actually know what the finances look like. And I made a comment to Bubsky on Twitter a couple days ago that I think clarified like some of the things that people just understand wrong about this that we can also talk about if you want. But like in general, like I think the people on Angel TV who wrote this, I haven't looked at who the author was, but I think they sort of almost certainly misunderstood what the reality is. And like how bad it is. I could be wrong. I don't know, but I suspect that the situation is not as dire.
I think that was my biggest thing, because the way it was reported, and then obviously how the trolls out there pick it all up, was that like, this is it, Astralis is about to crash and burn, everything is a mess, the whole place is closing down. And it didn't make sense to me because, one, obviously last year we saw them buy mega expensive players, renew contracts. We've seen them go in and out with players who I don't think are on cheap salaries. They've just announced they're bringing HooXi in till the end of the season. He's not going to be a cheap player. You know, people can say what they want about how he performs. He's still a tier 1 IGL, which is, and he's Danish, with Astralis desperately needs. So I'm sure he's asking for a lot. But over and above that, Astralis is not just the Counter-Strike team. They have, and Thorin and I actually spoke about this before we started recording. They have Astralis Nexus, which I've been to in Copenhagen. That is like prime real estate, massive double-story storefront right next to Tivoli, the big amusement park. They run like a gaming cafe from there. Downstairs, they have a retail store, so they obviously have Astralis merch, but they also have their sponsors products, like Logitech sells Logitech stuff there. I would presume, lurppis, and correct me if I'm wrong, if it is as dire as some might say, the rent on that whole setup, that would need to be shut down relatively quickly, right? If you're trying to save money. So is it just a matter of Astralis sniffing around for a buyer, realizing that maybe this isn't a valuable going concern in the future, and not necessarily this whole damn thing is going to fall apart and shut down in the next month?
So I think there's a couple of different things there. So I guess like one, just to briefly touch on it, there's like I don't know what the Danish law is like, but a lot of the time like you can't just shut down a thing you rent. Like a lot of the time, like if you rent something, you pay 100K a year in rent for 5 years, like you have 4 years left. You might be able to negotiate a deal where you pay 200, but if to get out of the $400,000 lease. But if you're short on cash to begin with, you might just rather like trickle it down at 8K a month, which is what it comes down to at 100K a year, rather than paying like the balloon payment at once. So like it might not actually be that easy. I don't know what that looks like in Denmark, but certainly like not that easy in the US to get out of leases. On like the selling part, there's actually many motivations to sell. Like people like to kind of paint it as like, well, like things must be going poorly, so let's sell this thing. And the way that it's like a funny way of thinking about it is like it takes two parties to do a transaction. Like if I'm selling something to you or Duncan, like you have to think it's worth what I'm asking for there to be a transaction. Like I can't just decide like this thing is bad, so I will now sell it, because there is always a buyer at like that inflated price. So there's many reasons. Like Astralis IPO'd in, I think it's 2019 December. Like they put together the company in like 2017, 2018, something like that, when he was still together with Blast before the separation. It might have been 2017 actually. I think 2018 he was already up and running. So like one thing to think about also is it was publicly listed, but like the stock wasn't very liquid. So I think many of the holders are the same that they've always had. There's a bunch of people who just like have finite holding periods for the funds from which they invest in. Like if you invested in Astralis 7 years ago and you think, you're probably a little somewhat underwater. I don't know by how much, depending on when you put in your money and what terms, but like let's just say that you're down 50 points on a million you put in 7 years ago. Like it might just be easier to just like cut your losses, call it a day. Like you're down 500K. Like what are the odds that it gets to something interesting? It'd be one thing if you think it's going to 10x from here. It's another if you think it's just like a fine investment. And like that, it's like a different calculus sometimes because of these like other frictions, like say like the life of your fund. Like you might have 7 years to make investments and 5 years to like close everything down, and it becomes increasingly harder to like extend it. There's like a lot of these frictions that make it difficult that might motivate somebody to sell. There's also like it might be that the people who are running it just like have been running it for several years, like don't really want to be the management team anymore. Like maybe it's hard to raise money for this thing now, which by the way it is. Like it's very hard to raise money for anything esports in the current environment. And like it's like hard to attract talent, and like it might just be easier to reset. And on the other hand, like if people are just willing to sell, maybe just one out of the headache, it might still end up being a good investment for somebody else because you're resetting at a new level. So I just think in general, there's just like way more nuance than people like to think. And like the kind of black and white, well, they're selling, so they lost. Like, yeah, I mean, most investors have lost money on Astralis. Not everybody, but like most almost certainly have. But the math that I think it was Bubsky who put it out, where he said like, well, they IPO'd and it was worth this, and now it's this, and they're down 97%. I think was like wrong enough that it's like bordering on intentional misinformation. And I guess like for the people who didn't see the comment on that, it's like they sold their LEC slot in the interim, and they definitely paid out like the value that they received to shareholders. So if it was worth 80 million, by the way, like they raised very little. Like you typically only raise a tiny bit of money in the IPO. So like most people invested at a lower valuation, not at 80 million. So if they took out 40 million from the company today, I think the report was like 30 to 40 million for the LEC team. Call it even 30. Like that might actually get most people whole. Like most people who put in money early on might be fine. It might be the people who invested in it as a public company who might be losers. But even then, like, it's down 50%. Like if you look at, this is not to say like being down 50% is good, but like I would venture a guess that most things in esports are down 50%. In fact, like almost anything that remains like mostly unprofitable is down 50% just because of interest rates going up. So it's not this like, yeah, like was it a good investment? Like no. Like has esports played out the way people thought 7 years ago? Like absolutely not. Like are the growth prospects as good as people thought in 2018 when they were launching like all these franchise leagues and like you have tons of money pouring in? Like no. But my position is that I kind of expect this to be like some years of sort of lull, slow down, and then like eventually it sort of starts growing again, and you'll like in the long term you'll see this chart that looks like this, and it went down, and then it just like continued, and like once you zoom out long enough,
When
it
you go
kind of
to the
just like
10-year
looks like
span. Yeah,
yeah, it kind
exactly.
of just like looks like
Yes.
year-to-year variation. I don't know if
By
that
the
answers the
way,
question. I kind of just
yeah,
talked
you went around it. I
vaguely.
will say this, Sam. One piece of advice for any layman entering this area is you have to understand it's like fucking the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The economics world is so laden with traps and hidden concepts you don't know that like you will just fuck up. You may as well just turn out and leave the tomb without any of that. Because put it this way, your mistake there, Sam, was a mistake I've made a million times. You attempted to use simple common logic as to whether what would make sense to do. That is not the way any businesses, and especially not esports businesses, work. Like, I'll give you an example. I'll use a very safe one that's not from Counter-Strike. Years and years ago, when MLG was at its absolute height, it was in its pomp, it had massive amounts of employees, it was doing loads of events in America. This is before it was bought by ESL, I believe. They had a time period where, during like the COVID period and all that jazz, they were hiring people because they had all the loans and all the like reduced costs and running things all that. So they were hiring people, as far as I know, to like run all the events and positions. So essentially, during the boom cycle, they just hired people. The second they had a bad quarter where they weren't going to make their numbers, they just fired everyone. And that might not make sense, Sam, because that's not the way a normal human would ever run a business. Like, you hire people because you want to work for them. No. Their logic was like, when things are going awesome, you can just buy. And when things are going badly, fuck, I have to get a result by the end of this month. So you just fight. What you do is you just remove enough salaries so that at the end, the numbers still like just made it there. So essentially, the real problem with all business stuff in esports is you actually can't run it like you demand. Like, put it this way, when everyone hears that story, like they did 2 years ago about ENTs, they go, oh, brilliant. That's how all esports orgs should be run. And I always tell people, no, because one, if you know how ENTs actually did it in CS, they did it by stuff like incredible specialist knowledge of people like Saw and Snappy to like scout the players. Like, that doesn't automatically come to an org of that size. You're essentially outperforming bigger orgs at scouting to get the players cheaper. And then secondly, they also would have been absolutely fucked if they'd have just not made that one major. That one major brought so much of the sticker money. So the problem in CS and esports in general goes like this. It's quite a counterintuitive principle. But believe it or not, almost everyone is actually incentivized to run it to the absolute fucking bleeding edge, Sam, and to redline the fuck out of the engine. Because as lurppis is basically sort of saying here, what you're really going for is just home runs. You're not actually trying to run a mom and pop business that increases 1% income every year. And eventually, after 10 years, you go, here's all the money back that you invested. No one's investing in esports to just get their money back. They're investing in the premise that you're either going to get nothing, it's going to completely tank, or it's going to 100x and we're all going to be millionaires and lol, we're all in the gravy train. So you have to keep that in mind, unfortunately, because essentially that's why, even though I just said it myself, that's why Astralis absolutely could be like, right, sign all these players, and then a week later be like, fuck, we might have to sell loads of stuff. Like, that's just unfortunately the way these businesses week to week, month to month, depending on what the numbers are, can be running. And lastly, I'll bring it back because I actually brought up the quote here. One, the two things that fucked this story up is, as said, Bobski, who is just someone who was just a video game player. Yeah, I don't know that he has any background in economics. He did essentially bungle looking up. He did that classic thing where like a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. He saw those numbers, and in his brain, because it was like 3% value left. Well, yeah, that must be it. Must be done, because he didn't understand that's not all that matters. And then secondly, good old Overdrive was the one who broke this. And he didn't just say they're in trouble. He phrased it like this. And again, I'm just going to go ahead and say this. As far as I know, Overdrive, just a Russian guy who knows about CS, also not an economics major. He said, Astralis is on the verge of bankruptcy! Exclamation point. By the way, that already in itself has so many crazy assumptions there. Then he goes, there are two options. Also probably not true, by the way. He goes, either the organization closes. I think that's even an option. Like, not even we're going to sell it off, we're talking, we're just going to close it. You know what? It's closed. Like 404 on the Astralis website. Anyway, he goes, the organization closes or is sold to new owners! Exclamation point. As far as I know, that he's sort of like exaggerated a lot of that. Like, put it this way, yeah, it might be in financial trouble. That seems like he's gone too far there, though, Tommy, surely. How could he even know they're on the verge of bankruptcy? You'd have to like have a crazy inside source for that, surely.
I don't think that's knowable. I think like
How could anyone know that?
just to backtrack that tiny bit, the
Go on.
point that you make is like obviously like hyperbole a little bit on like just like how you run a business.
Yeah.
But the point that actually was correct that people I just want to double click on because I think it's a good point that people miss is like people like all the companies that raise like venture money, from family offices, whomever, like you said, they like those people don't invest for a 80% chance of making 5% a year. Like you could get better at public markets. Like you do private investments with like high growth prospects for the chance of doing really well. And like somebody will ask like, okay, but like why are you just like gambling? But like that is not their only investment. So like when you think about these things, like if there are 30 of these teams that have raised money, like that's from 30 like incredibly, like all of them have probably 10 different big investors, something like that. And then like all of those have probably 100 different investments. And like that specific thing is like 1% of the small thing that they own. And if it goes down 50% over 7 years, that's 50 bips over 7 years. So they're losing 0.07% a year on that. And like they have something else that has a similar risk profile and that ends up working out. And like, so like it's like hard to think about these in a vacuum, but like that
Yes.
that point broadly is right. Like nobody wants you to just run a thing that makes 5% a year forever. Like that might be a better outcome for the business. And like, by the way, like that is the kind of thing that usually happens when you do, like if they end up selling for, it's called like a fire sale price of like, I think the HLTV reports at like 2 to 3 million, like probably the next person is going to be, because they bought it so cheap and they're going to own it. Like if that transaction goes through at 2 to 3 million, the next person probably is going to be happy to just run it and like make 5% a year, 10% a year, whatever. And like that might be a good outcome for them, but that is not necessarily the case for the people before. I don't think there's any way at all that you could possibly know like how how they're doing. I guess like one thing I always wonder, and I should have looked at this before we jumped on the call, but Denmark's one of the countries that forces companies to actually like
Yes.
post their financials
Yeah.
online. I think it's pretty delayed, so 2024 wouldn't have come out. So like even if you looked at them, you would have only seen 2023 at this point, not
Thing is, as far as I
2024.
remember, you even did tweet on this. This is why I knew Bobski was wrong, Lurppis, because as far as I know, I think after 2023's Astralis numbers came out, you even did do a tweet where, contrary to what most people thought, because they were also going off the raw stock price, dude, you basically point
Yeah.
out, like, if you looked at what I think it's even when they even sold the slot or whatever it was, you just looked at it and you actually said, this is probably actually a decent year, actually, if you look at the financials, they sort of add up.
Yeah, no, it was doing well at the time, but like I think LEC was a good asset. They sold it, so like I don't know how it's gone
Sure.
since. So like it's just much more volatile, which is the
Also, by the way, technically, if you look it up, I did look it up as we were talking. They did do a thing, which is the way all the modern sales go, I notice in LEC, which is no one really sells the entire slot Lurppers. What actually happens, as far as I know, is they sold like 2/3 of it, and then they keep a third, and then it gets renamed to like Carmine Corp or whatever. But as far as I know, if you look this up, it says it. First of all, I believe there's like an option to sell the rest later. And then secondly, I believe you do that because everyone thinks LEC in the long run is valuable, so they don't want to get out completely. So I believe that they should even also have part of an asset there. Like that could also be
yeah.
sold too.
Yeah, I mean, there always is like some kind of
That's
put
got to
up,
be a few million
some kind
probably
of
there,
put.
you know.
Yeah, so like I think that's like, but to go back to the overdrive point, which is like there's just like no way to know in reality, like unless you talk to the people who are like actually running the company, like there is
Yes.
no way of like all these things. It's a lot easier to like think about these things if you just think about like who would want this information to get out. Like this is like Astralis is not like a particularly big company at this point. Because like one of the reasons they wanted to go back private is that you can just reduce cost of like public
Yes.
reporting, like all the stuff that you have to do as a public company. So like I don't, like is it possible that there's like a junior employee working in their accounting department who told their friend at a bar? Like sure, but like is that the likeliest way that this information got disseminated? No. It seems much more likely that like somebody misinterpreted something somewhere and
Yes.
they talked to somebody who talked to somebody and
Yes.
then it became like a credible, which is like exactly how some of the roster move rumors
Oh, of
start out
course.
too. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like
That's why that's the joke, of course, Overdrive. He's even saying it like he would say a fucking roster move, like mine is simple plus cadiaN. Like, it's almost like that, isn't it? It's just like some shit you heard. And also, I'm going to agree with you. Listen, Overdrive, if you're telling me a rumor about a Russian player joining an org, I believe you. I think you might know about that. The idea, like you're saying, Lurppis, the hottest story of the year about like Danish CS doesn't get to, Richard Lewis, who's famously hated Astralis the whole time and has all the connections. No, it gets to Overdrive, the roster move guy. Like, I don't know about that, Overdrive. Maybe you did just stumble on the craziest source of all time, but I don't know about that.
The other thing that I would just point is anytime you see a dollar amount reported, good or bad, I would just like think who has the motivation to
Yes.
show what in the press release. Like there's this famous example of the NHL actually, where Gary Bettman has like famously had like a bunch of announcements where they've had this like creative ways of reporting the purchase price so that they can continue showing over the years that like the
Right.
value of
So it looks
NHL
like it goes
prices
up.
have gone up. Yeah.
Right.
And so like
Right.
if you think about something like this, like you're kind of exiting an asset. Like if I put myself in the shoes of Astralis owners, I don't care what the press says. Like I'm probably taking a, like to the extent that there are winners or losers, like I'm the loser on the PR front no matter what. Like I care how much money I'm getting. So like if you are buying it from me and you care a little bit about like looking like a smart businessman and like, oh, I actually did a good deal here and somebody else should give me money to do something else later. You might trade off a little bit of value in exchange for like we just don't talk about the price and like you get to claim whatever. Like I would take, if it says two to three, like I don't know, maybe it's 2 to 3 million today. Like if assuming that's even real, of course. But like maybe it's 2 to 3 million today, and maybe I get 50% of all the stickers for the next like 10 years. And like, like there's a lot of structure in these things. And like typically the higher the valuation or the lower the valuation, the more structure you end up with. So like if you pay very little today, there probably is something like going out, and that might end up being a very bad deal for you or a very good deal for you, depending on how it all shakes out. And similarly, like when you saw a lot of the news of
By
like
the way,
teams
as an
raising.
example for that, do you mean something like if I get to buy the org really cheap today, maybe it's that like I still get like I as the ex-owner, if you somehow get like to a major in 3 years, I get some of the sticker money or something that offset. Do you
Yeah,
mean something like that would be structured
yeah,
in? That's why it's so
yeah,
cheap
like
now? Because I'm
yeah,
gambling against the value of
correct.
today's purchase, right?
Correct. So like, because like a lot
Right.
of in this case in particular, actually, a lot of the value is gonna be the major qualifications. And you might
Yes.
say, like, well, you haven't qualified in 5 years, 5 events, whatever. I don't know if you're gonna qualify. And I say, okay, I think we will. How do we bridge that? Why don't you pay me if you do make it? And like that, depending
Yeah.
on how that ends up doing and how that is defined, like if there's a cap on the revenue share, if revenue goes, stickers go back to 4.5 million a team per, like in Paris, like, and I get half of that for 5 events, like maybe that ends up being an incredible deal. Maybe the values go up and that, there's all these things. And like, it's the same like on the other up. So when you saw in 2019, 2020, like teams raising money at these like super high valuations that like Ford reported on, a lot of the time that actually ends up being just very structured. So like you might want to print like a very high valuation, but there is in like an opposing way from the revenue share from stickers, there might be something that makes it a lot worse. Where actually, like, yeah, you get to say I raised money at 400 million, but it's really only 400 million in a narrow case where like everything works out this way. And if things don't work out that way, it actually gets adjusted through like all these different mechanisms to something where I'm happy to. So I would just always be
Yes.
always like question all the numbers that get reported, unless it's in like official filings where you
Put it
just
this
know
way,
what it is.
the famous one that was held as like the albatross around the neck of Team Liquid last year of like Skulls was 600,000. As far as I know, that was never even true. That was just like the maximum structuring of that deal. Lurppis, as in like, you had to qualify to a major, then there had to be a certain amount of, it's like that was like the total you could have ever paid out. But the point was they didn't pay that out as far as I know. So, and I think it was even offset against his salary. So again, I know what you mean. Like the real question is, why am I finding out this very specific number when no one is obliged to tell me it? Like you have to ask yourself what the motivation is as to why is there even a number on my screen right now? It's a good question to ask.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
a
I
good
mean,
question.
here's like one potential explanation. Like maybe like what Astralis actually wants is to sell the company. Maybe what they actually want is just like a little bit of money
So they're
today,
chumming the waters to get people to come.
but
Right.
the
Yeah.
promise tomorrow,
Right.
and like maybe putting out a very low number is gonna get a bunch of people, and some of those people will be able to get to 2 to 3 million. They wouldn't be able to raise the money, but
Right.
then they will be willing to give on like the stickers. By the way,
Right.
like that actually wouldn't be a bad structure if you were selling one of these businesses.
Yeah.
Like if you got to keep the upside that you think is the most meaningful
Yeah.
if it does work out. That's like, it's one theory. Like I don't know that it's any more right than just like a dumb rumor, but like you should always think about like
Sure.
whose incentive is it to leak it.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, I've got one last aspect that people always forget, Tommy. The part people always forget that is essential with Astralis is this detail. As far as I know, if you ever go and look at who like the top people are, they don't even mention Nickel and I anymore. Like there's someone else does the top job in Astralis and a bunch of other people do all the GMing and all this. But as far as I know, I think it was only something like last year or so, he'd finally reached the point where he would have vested all of his like shares in Astralis or something. So the other thing is, there also could be actually a very good reason as to why people who built Astralis to this point maybe just don't want to be involved anymore. Maybe maybe it didn't go where they wanted, maybe it did go where they wanted. But the point is, if you know how that works, they wouldn't have left like 4 years ago when things are going up and down. You wait till the end and try and complete the project. So as far as I know, this also might be why some of the more original people might choose to step out if that was indeed going to happen. It's just an obvious time period to sell, right?
One thing I thought I would maybe touch on quickly, unless Sam wanted to go in another direction, is like I said when the news came out that Valve was essentially banning the partner leagues, so like the predictable revenue share from Blast and ESL was going to go away. I think the tweet that I put out then, it should be still up, is something along the lines of like, this is just like a subsidy to Blast and ESL because they're going to get the same teams to participate, but they have to pay out less money. And like now they're forced to not do it. Now in practice, like they're still paying some.
They sort of did it through that club program thing
Yeah,
anyway. But true.
Sneaky way around.
True.
But it is a better deal for them than the case that it used to be. But what it actually did was just made the entire ecosystem like entirely dependent on making the majors, because like the sticker money ended up becoming the new de facto revenue share.
Yep.
Except it's not actually contracted. So like if you were a team that was both in ESL and Blast, like you could look at what the minimum guarantee across both was, and like you could kind of guess like where you were probably gonna be in like a given year, and you'd have some budget certainty. Now I think it's actually great that there's 32 teams in the major, just because it makes it a little bit more predictable. Like it's easier to make the cut for 32. I think sticker money will be down because there's more mouths to feed for presumably roughly the same amount of sales, but it makes it a little bit more predictable. But there is still like a gargantuan difference between being the team on the bubble and like winning the last game versus missing out. And one of the things that makes it very difficult is if you look at like Astralis, this is like completely off the top of my head. I haven't looked at this since probably I put out that tweet you mentioned a while ago. I think they made like 12 million of revenue, 15 million of revenue in 23. This was like before they sold the LEC slot. Right. So like assume like probably half of that roughly, or a third of that went away with that. I think it was mostly Counter-Strike. And so like the remaining business had like maybe 8 million a year, something like that of revenue, roughly break even. I think something like that was the math at the time off the top of my head. Now like there's this, for people who actually want to see what financials for a team look like, for like a well-run team, there's an HBS, Harvard Business School case about Team Liquid, where you can go on like the Harvard like Business Review website or whatever, and I think it costs like $15. And like that actually, like it's like a case of, you know, like their growth talks about like some of the decisions they made. Like I didn't think it was like particularly insightful in many of that, but they actually have financials. You can actually see their financials in like decent level of detail, and it like these look similar to like team financials that I've seen many times over. So it's not that surprising to me. I think it would be very helpful for a lot of people who talk about it and don't really have a sense of it. So like I would consider doing that just for like to understanding it better. But the one thing that I wanted to call out is the difference in size between somebody like Liquid and these other teams. Like they're not even like competing in the same sport. Like Liquid, and there's probably a couple of other ones that are at like a similar level, just in
G2,
terms of scale.
I'm guessing, you know, yeah,
like,
sure.
They're just so much bigger than everybody else that like I honestly have no idea how the small teams, like say like ENCE, for example, like I just don't know how you can be competitive. And like we used to, so like Immortals exited the LCS at the end of last year. We're one of the teams that were happy to just get out. Like we did not think that like the model that Immortals was running like could work. Like you had to be one of the big ones. You had to spend a bunch of money, and like we were not believers in that, obviously. Like what the joke that we used to say every once in a while is like, yeah, like we get it. Like we understand that like Cloud9 and Team Liquid would want to pay more revenue share for Cloud9 and Team Liquid because they are the most valuable teams. Like there's no question. Like they brought way more value to the LCS than Immortals did, or like many of the other teams did. But like if you don't pay some amount of money for the other teams, like you have nobody to play against. Like you can't have a 2-person League of Legends league where it's just Team Liquid and Cloud9 playing every week because they were the ones who just did the best job. And like, you know, it's like a hard problem to solve because in theory, like, yeah, I agree. Like they should get paid more. Like they've done the best job. They built the best business. Like they have figured out a way to monetize it. Like pay them more because they bring more of the value. But you look at what Team Liquid does. Like I think it was like around 60 million a year in 22-23. Like there's a lot of these smaller teams that are like game specific. Like I would guess that most of the Counter-Strike teams that are not part of these like big organizations with like League of Legends or Valorant, I would guess most of them do low single digit millions.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So like
Oh, yeah,
now,
sure.
just so you know, like one way to think about like the scale difference is like if you're running a business that does 60 million and you're roughly break even, that implies that your cost base is 60 million. So like the amount of cash that you have sitting around just for like fluctuations month to month on like when payments come in, go out, whatever, is somewhat scaled to the 60 million if you're running the business in a smart way. Like you're not, like if you have a $10 billion business, you probably need more cash day to day than you do if it's one person lemonade stand. But then you compare that to, let's even take Astralis, like that was 8 million a couple years ago. I don't know if it's up or down. Like that probably included stickers, so that portion is probably down. But say like 8 million, like that is like almost a tenth of the size. So like you just have far less flexibility in a world where the two are still competing for the same players. They're still competing to like get in the same Saudi partner team thing that is just kind of about like playing in a lot of different games and like being able to participate and like get points from just like fielding many teams. And it might be that is just like positive EV. Like everybody should just field the teams and get in because it's good money.
Yeah.
But maybe you just, we talked
You
about the
don't have the
pad
money to do
dependency.
it.
Yeah, like we
Yeah.
talked about the pad dependency. Like maybe you just can't afford to spend the money here to get in so that you
Yes.
would be better off here. So I think there's just like this kind of a haves and have-nots difference that I think is probably going to get worse, not better, based on like how things are. And I think that was the one thing that the Valve decision actually, perhaps surprisingly to people, made worse. And the cynical take, and I think this is kind of how Valve thinks about it based on my conversations from at this point, like many years ago, is like it's about the players, not about the teams. Like completely fine. Like that's who people care about. Like they want to see the players play. But like, are you gonna get the same number of players in a hypothetical world where the business doesn't work for anybody but the 5 biggest teams? Because there's a difference between Monesi at 16. I'm guessing like had to drop out of school like around then to like play all these tournaments when he started traveling. Like, are you willing to do it if your hope is to win prizes versus if you're getting paid more in salary than like anybody in your family tree has ever made? Like, there's a big difference between the guaranteed salary that you're going to start getting
Sure.
today versus, hey, like we might win prize money, we might not. And that is like the predictability that people sometimes gloss over because like many of these guys are like late 20s or early 30s or even mid 20s. Like they might want to live in an apartment, they might have expenses, they might have to pay for rent. Like there's like actual costs associated with living that get bigger and like more important as you get older, just like naturally. And I think the more important just like having predictable income becomes when you get older. So that is like one part of it that many people don't, I think, just like to talk about. That's kind of worked until now, but I think it's been getting worse and worse, candidly. And I think if I had to predict, I think the outcome is that like you probably not only like you should essentially just like kill off like 80% of the teams and just end up with like 10 that it's not a monopoly, but like 10 that are just like big enough and have kind of
Essentially a super league.
aggregated
It's just
all
the
the
obvious thing
power.
to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Yes.
that's where
Just
you
is.
actually should
Yeah.
end up. But again, like how do you solve the grassroots
Yes.
level then? Like that is much harder.
By the way, one thing to point out that's a very key thing to echo for this episode is if you're only from Counter-Strike, you're actually probably going to be shocked by what you just said because in your brain, you were like, but Astralis was better than Team Liquid. It's like, yeah, but it's the Team Liquid org. Here's the piece of trivia that'll let you know the difference. When the Saudis did that EWC that had that like big club prize where it was millions of dollars, look, the joke is the Saudis' own team, Falcons, won it. But second was Team Liquid because Team Liquid has 1 bazillion games that they're represented in and using the stipends they invested in got top players. People like Astralis wouldn't even have been on the list. Like, first of all, they were relevant in CS anyway, but like Astralis isn't even in the same stratosphere as Team Liquid or G2 or Cloud9, like he says. Like, the joke is they will get one sponsorship deal that's worth more than the entire revenue of Astralis. Astralis is an org that used to be, by the way, at this time, the word used to was a fucking load-bearing word. It's about 5 years ago they actually had like a truly world-class Counter-Strike team. So at this point in time, think about this, guys. Imagine someone going on about NIP in like 2018. Yeah, well, the lineup's gone that made all the the great 87 and 0. So that doesn't help you. And then aside from that, all they had aside from that, as far as I know, I think they maybe had like some other game as well. But it was mainly just League of Legends, and they got rid of that last year because they sold the spot to the Carmine Corp. So actually, Astralis doesn't have that much. Like, essentially, what people aren't realizing is Astralis is closer to Ents than they are to Cloud9, which sounds like a crazy concept if you only know the game.
It's pretty interesting though. Astralis, I was going to say, for they had their main CS team, they had their women's CS team, and then they had their sort of development team. And
Sure.
I know that they got rid of the women's team. I think it was last year. I've just seen that their sort of academy team is gone now. They've stopped that as well. So they literally have the Counter-Strike team, which is not qualified for the major, has PGL Astana and nothing else. I mean, that's all they have right now.
You know what's a bit rough, by the way? That's one of those things people don't want to hear this, but that's because those two teams just lose your money completely anyway. You don't have the you don't have the 100x upside. So those are the first ones you cut, I'm afraid. It's why Pretty Square in League of Legends, it's why all the big orgs just said, please let us not have to have an academy team as soon as it was possible. Yeah, why not just shed that? Why not get rid of that, you know?
So I was gonna make 2 points. One, like I think the last time we spoke was about we talked about academy teams, I think. Right. At least like we have talked about academy. I think it was us three the previous time we did this. And that was like still reasonably soon after the LCS allowed us to drop the academy teams. But like we in 2020, like we had like somebody just run the analysis. Like look at every single player who ever played in the LCS. Like look at where they played before. Did they play in the academy? Like did they play in LCS, go into the academy and come back? Like we just mapped everybody who ever played in the LCS since the launch of the LCS, and like became very obvious that like you just don't get good players from academy. And we went to Riot and we said like we don't think there is a way to make this work. Like this is the data. Like this is our analysis. Like we don't think this does anything to like actually help people get here. Like it might have other value.
Yeah,
of
course.
But like this is not the thing that it is accomplishing. And on the CS side, you know, like it's a lot easier to justify the academy programs when you're actually spending a bunch of money on like buyouts and like things are going well. Because part of it, and we talked about this before, like part of the genius in like building the academy teams, besides that, like some teams have actually done incredibly well in like developing players, like no question about it, mostly from the CIS region, because that's where the talent ends up being, and in Brazil, like those are the two big places. But the genius in that is that what it allows you to do is to just keep the fourth and fifth players on the team sort of on their toes, and like because it just became impossible like 5 years ago to pay 5 players like they're all shocks. Like you couldn't pay the Smiths equivalent, not to pick on the guy, but like that was the example back then. Like you couldn't pay everybody 25k a month. It had to be like you might pay shocks 30k a month, but you need 2 guys who are on 4k, 5k a month, and that's how you actually get to a reasonable place. And like the way to get there might be easier through an academy. And by the way, like one thing about academy is the game theory of it is if everybody else has an academy team, you need an academy team.
Yes.
Because like if everybody else is locking up players but you're not, then like you don't have access to that entire second layer. Like you can't get anybody from there. You might do worse than everybody else to begin with, but you need some players to pick up. When everybody starts dropping academy teams, now it doesn't have any value. Because like you can just pick up the same players from like the next level of feeder teams, so long as the ecosystem is healthy enough to still fund those. So it's actually one of those things that if everybody drops, like as more teams drop their academy teams, the less valuable it becomes for the remaining teams.
Yes. By the way, that's even where that thing way earlier back in the convo about what if all the salaries were known. I can tell you, people would have been way less harsh on those people like Buzz and all those guys. If you look, I'm going to make up a spitball number. If you knew they were making like 5k a month instead of like I'm imagining Blame F was making like 35k a month, people would have judged those guys very differently.
For sure. So we've gone over the hour that we normally have, but I found this super fascinating, so I don't care. I do have one last question though. We've spoken a lot about Astralis buying, selling. I mean, at the end of the day, how does it affect the players currently in this team? HooXi is obviously not signed. He's a temporary stand-in for PGL Astana. Well, till the end of the season, they say, which for them is PGL Astana. But what about the other players currently in that team? What does this whole thing mean for them?
So I think a lot of it depends on one, the players, and then two, just how the organization communicates it to them. Like, because there's like a couple of ways that you could perceive it from the inside. if we take like the extreme examples, one might be that you've been in like a somewhat sketchy organization. Like I think Kassad had this issue for like many, many months before the news came out that Bleed hadn't paid players for like months and months and months. And like at that point, if you see a news post, like he wakes up one day and it says like Bleed might be running out of cash, like he's going to be very concerned because he's already owed money. And like, even if he's not owed money, like maybe there's been just issues where like salaries have been late or like, oh, like, sorry, we missed the payroll, like, but it'll be on your account on Monday. Like that is a very different context from like you've been here in Device's case, like for, 7 years, less the short period in NIP. And like maybe every single payment has ever come to your account in 5 minutes and you've never had any issues. And like you call somebody, they always pick up the phone. Like he's probably not going to be very concerned in that. And then like there's like everything in the middle between those two. And there's also the, like did the players know anything about it? Like, is this real? First of all, like just one, like, is it real? Like if it is real, like did the players know? Probably not. But then like how do you communicate it after? And like what do they make of it? And like what are you willing or even able to share in that case? And like if it's not real, like you gotta communicate it, and then it's like, do you actually have the trust of the players? And like some of that again I think comes down to like if I were a player, like mostly be concerned of like, am I getting my next paycheck? I think, but like bunch of these players I think will find a next home. Like if Astralis, I don't think this will happen if it shut down tomorrow. I think Device would be on a good team as soon as he felt comfortable. He's like legally out of his contract. That wouldn't be a problem. So I think there's just like a broad range of what it means for player to player. I don't know what Duncan thinks.
By the way, there's two things I have an obvious thought about. One is, I will say, if you are a player tomorrow who joins Astralis in this new regime, if there's going to be one, I hope you know you're not actually joining Astralis. Like the days of you all joining and being like, hey, we're all going to make like 50K a month. I doubt it. Like in the modern world, you're probably just going to be on something reasonable, which by the way, here's the thing that'll really blow the minds of some people out there. G2 and Vitality are years ahead of you idiots. They haven't been paying those giga salaries for fucking years. Like that's not even a thing. It's why when people talk about Vitality, I know that you just don't know Counter-Strike. They've just done a great job GMing and making it an attractive place to go. Like they've never been on Falcons fucking money, except maybe if you're Ziwu. So already that's not even a thing. I actually think Astralis, if anything, the last few years, part of what let them get by on people thinking they're a big org is that in Counter-Strike specifically, they clearly overpaid to have the best Danish talent and to have big names and to have devices. Like, by the way, even though it didn't accomplish much in the game, they did sort of win by getting device back. That gave you a connection to the past, to minutes to go, hey, it's still Astralis, bro. Whoa, this is important. It's why people in their brain thought it made sense to go from heroic to Astralis. I used to say it doesn't make any sense. You're both on like dodgy financial territory and they're better. Like, why would you leave that org? That doesn't even make sense. But people do it. But the bigger thing I would say is this, which is as we move forwards, like this is why the Overdrive Telegram message was insane the way it was phrased, because he made it sound like, look, you either just sell it completely or it's over tomorrow. And it's like the chances of it being over tomorrow have got to be close to almost zero, Tommy. Like if you're really, think about it, if I really have a choice, I'm going to shutter the doors. At that point, it is a fire sale. But first of all, I don't even believe it is that. We've just explained why in this episode. They probably have way more assets, way more wiggle room. It might just even be a short-term liquidity issue that they can just sell certain things off or downsize, get rid of a few salaries, pay a few contracts out early without pay, whatever it might be. That at this point in time, that just gets you to the point where either you get more investment or you can just keep going as a company. But even if you had to sell it all off, the idea nobody would want the brand Astralis associated with fucking Danish cats, it's absurd, mate. Like that's if me and the joke is if they really do have no money, me and Lurppis will buy it for $10 tomorrow and start our run Astralis. Like you'd be a fool not to. What you could do with like the marketing of that alone is worth money. So I think the worst part of this whole thing was just the idea that if you're a fan of Astralis or a player, you actually think that like tomorrow it might just get announced it's over, like a fucking old clan with like a twit longer or something. That's not going to happen. Don't even worry about that. Like rest assured there will be an Astralis, I would guess, in CS.
Oh, we'll wrap with just knowing that Duncan has a bid for $10.
There you go.
$10.
Or nearest offer. There you go.
All right, we'll pull our $10 together and we can buy Astralis and we can run an esports team and we'll make a twit longer about how we're running it now, like all those other little orgs do. This has been fascinating. I've learned a lot. One of the most important things is that I won't be investing in esports organizations.
Okay, right. Well, you've learned then. Unlike a lot of people, you have learned from your hour.
I'll just carry on being an employee. If you have anything you want to add to this, drop it in the comments and we'll see you soon for another episode.